Have you ever wondered why millions of Seventh-day Adventists around the globe begin their sacred day of rest on Friday evening, precisely as the sun dips below the horizon rather than waiting for the stroke of midnight or Saturday morning? To many outside observers, this timing feels unusual, almost like stepping into another era. In a modern society where our schedules are governed by digital clocks, 24-hour calendar days, and midnight transitions, stopping everything at dusk on a Friday can seem completely out of step with the modern world. Visitors who attend an Adventist church or spend a weekend with an Adventist family often notice a dramatic shift in atmosphere as Friday afternoon draws to a close. Business dealings are wrapped up, work emails are put away, household chores come to a halt, and a deep sense of quiet reverence fills the home long before the traditional weekend even begins for most people. But why do Adventists structure their sacred time in this specific way? Is it simply a cultural tradition, a nostalgic custom passed down through generations? Or is there a deep, ancient biblical principle that defines this practice? To understand why Seventh-day Adventists keep the Sabbath from sunset to sunset, we must look beyond modern customs and return to the very beginning of the biblical record. When you open the primary pages of the Holy Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, you discover that the divine definition of a day is fundamentally different from our modern secular standard. In Genesis chapter 1, during the grand account of creation, the Bible establishes a repeating pattern for the passage of time. After each distinct act of creation, the Scripture explicitly states, "And the evening and the morning were the first day, and the evening and the morning were the second day," and so on, continuing through all 6 days of creation week. Notice the specific biblical sequence. Evening comes first, followed by the morning. The dark part of the cycle precedes the light part. In the ancient Hebrew mindset established by the Creator himself, a complete 24-hour day does not begin in the middle of the night at midnight, nor does it begin at dawn when the sun rises. Instead, the day commences at sunset, when dusk settles and the light transitions into evening. When God instituted the seventh-day Sabbath in Genesis chapter 2, blessing it and setting it apart as holy, this foundational measurement of time was already firmly in place. Later in salvation history, when God gave explicit instructions to the children of Israel regarding their holy observances, this principle was reiterated with total clarity. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, verse 32, while describing a sacred rest, God provides a precise instruction concerning timekeeping. "From even unto even shall ye celebrate your Sabbath." The word even in biblical language refers directly to evening or sunset. Therefore, for thousands of years, the ancient Israelites and the Hebrew people measured every sacred day from the moment the sun went down until the sun set again the following evening. When Seventh-day Adventists observe the Sabbath today, they are aligning their lives directly with this original creation model and the explicit instructions preserved in the Old Testament scriptures. This historical and scriptural foundation often raises intriguing questions for those learning about Adventism for the first time. Many people grew up thinking of days purely in terms of midnight to midnight, which is a legal system of timekeeping inherited largely from the ancient Romans rather than the Holy Scriptures. When non-Adventists realize that the Sabbath actually starts on Friday night, it can create a moment of genuine wonder and curiosity. Take a moment to reflect on your own life and traditions. How do you usually mark the start of your day? And have you ever considered how changing when a day begins might change your perspective on rest? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, as I would love to hear how your own background influences the way you view sacred time. As we look deeper into the Bible, we discover that this sunset practice was not just an ancient Old Testament ritual that faded away over time. In fact, when we examine the life of Jesus Christ in the New Testament Gospels, as well as the historical records of the early Christian church, we find clear evidence that this evening-to-evening cycle remained the standard way God's people observed time. But how did this practice carry over into the lives of early Christians? And how exactly did it become such a central identity marker for Seventh-day Adventists in the 19th century and today? As we examine the New Testament record, we see that Jesus Christ himself lived, walked, and ministered within this exact evening-to-evening rhythm of time. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus routinely observed the Sabbath day from sunset on Friday evening until sunset on Saturday evening. A striking example of this is recorded in the Gospel of Mark chapter 1, where Jesus healed many sick and afflicted people in the town of Capernaum. The scripture notes in verse 32, "And at even, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased." Why did the crowds wait until the sun had set to bring their sick loved ones to Jesus? Because the Sabbath hours had officially ended at sunset on Saturday evening, allowing the people to carry their heavy burdens and travel without fear of violating the traditional Sabbath restrictions of their day. This detail confirms that in the time of Christ, every single individual understood that the sacred day transitioned precisely at dusk. When the Seventh-day Adventist movement arose in the mid-19th century in the United States, early believers deeply desired to align every aspect of their faith with the pure teachings of the Bible. In the early 1840s and 1850s, as these early pioneer Christians began studying the fourth commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, which commands us to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, they initially debated the exact starting time for the Sabbath. Some early pioneers kept the Sabbath from 6 o'clock on Friday evening to 6 o'clock on Saturday evening, using a fixed clock time for convenience. However, after intensive biblical study led by pioneers such as John Nevins Andrews, the young movement recognized that the Bible explicitly commanded the Sabbath to be kept from even unto even. By 1855, the fledgling church officially adopted the biblical sunset-to-sunset principle, cementing a practice that remains a cornerstone of Adventist identity to this very day. In modern Adventist church life across the United States and around the world, this sunset-to-sunset cycle creates a deeply meaningful routine known as welcoming the Sabbath. On Friday afternoon, long before dusk arrives, Adventist households begin preparing. Homes are cleaned, meals are prepared in advance, and professional work is deliberately set aside. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon on Friday evening, families gather together in their living rooms, light candles, sing hymns, read scripture, and pray together, welcoming the Sabbath hours as a holy visitor. This period from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset is affectionately referred to as the sacred edges, or guarding the edges of the Sabbath. On Saturday afternoon, as the Sabbath draws to a close, families often gather once more for a sunset worship service to give thanks for the rest they received and to transition peacefully back into the secular work week. Despite the clear scriptural foundation, outsiders sometimes misunderstand this practice, assuming it is a burdensome burden or a rigid legalistic burden. Critics might wonder if Adventists spend their Fridays constantly anxiously checking weather apps or calculating exact astronomical times out of fear. However, for practicing Adventists, the sunset boundary is experienced not as a cold legal obligation, but as a protective boundary, a divine invitation to step out of the relentless stress of modern commercial life and enter into sacred communion with God and loved ones. If you are watching this and have experienced a special weekly routine, family tradition, or dedicated time of rest in your own life, how do you mark the boundary between your busy work week and your time of rest? I welcome you to share your story in the comments section so we can learn from one another's experiences. Yet beyond the historical timeline and the practical routines of preparation, there is a much profound spiritual secret embedded within the evening-to-evening cycle. Why would God design a day to begin with darkness and move toward the light, rather than starting with the brightness of dawn? What deep spiritual lesson about human grace, trust, and creation is hidden in the shadows of Friday sunset? When we look deeper into the spiritual meaning behind the sunset-to-sunset Sabbath, we discover a profound message about God's grace and human dependence. In the modern world, human beings are conditioned to believe that our day begins when we wake up, put on our clothes, and start working. We measure our worth by our productivity, our achievements, and how much we can accomplish during the daylight hours. But the biblical model flips this human philosophy entirely on its head. When a Sabbath day begins at sunset, human beings are called to enter into God's sacred rest, not by working, but by sleeping, resting, and trusting. Think about the profound theology of this cycle. On Friday evening, as dusk falls, you do not begin the holy day by striving, laboring, or earning God's favor. You begin it by resting. God works while we sleep. The dark hours of the evening remind us that the world is sustained by the power of God, not by our endless human effort. We enter into his finished work. Just as Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day and immediately experienced their first full day on earth as a day of Sabbath rest with their Creator, Adventists are reminded every Friday evening that salvation and righteousness are free gifts from God, received through faith before we ever perform a single act of work. The movement from darkness to light throughout the Sabbath hours symbolizes our spiritual journey out of the darkness of sin and into the glorious light of God's love and truth. Sometimes sincere people raise respectful objections to keeping the Sabbath from sunset to sunset. A common question arises regarding regions of the world near the North or South Poles, where the sun may not set or rise for several months at a time during extreme summer or winter seasons. Critics ask, how can anyone keep a sunset-to-sunset Sabbath in places like northern Alaska or Scandinavia? Seventh-day Adventists address this practical question with good judgment and biblical equity. In extreme polar regions where the sun remains above or below the horizon for extended periods, Adventist guidelines recommend keeping the Sabbath according to the standard times of the nearest region where regular sunsets occur, or by using a consistent 24-hour cycle based on standard local time. God's law was designed for humanity's benefit, and where nature experiences extreme polar anomalies, the principle of sacred periodic rest remains unchanged. Another objection comes from those who feel that tracking sunset times is overly detailed or unnecessary under the new covenant. However, Adventists view the fourth commandment not as a ritualistic ceremonial law that ended at the cross, but as a perpetual moral gift established at creation for all of humanity. Honoring the specific boundaries of time that God established in Genesis is an act of loving loyalty and obedience to the Creator who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. By stopping our weekly rush at Friday sunset, Adventists demonstrate that God is the true owner of our time, our work, and our lives. It is a weekly sanctuary and time carved out by God to refresh our souls, heal our relationships, and anchor our faith in a chaotic world. Thank you so much for taking the time to explore this fascinating biblical tradition with us today on the Adventist Files. We deeply appreciate your open heart, your thoughtful presence, and your interest in understanding the Scriptures more clearly. If you enjoyed this video and want to discover more about Seventh-day Adventist beliefs, biblical history, and Christian living, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the notification bell so you never miss a future study. God bless you as you seek His truth, and may you find true rest in His loving presence.